Most folks hear a whistle in a diesel engine and think repair bill. When Tommy Hansen heard that sound at 18, it meant he was about to lose everything. It was a thin, high-pitched whistle, like a tea kettle boiling dry, coming from his father's pickup that August morning. 3 hours later, Tommy stood in the driveway of the only home he'd ever known, watching his old man stuff his belongings into black garbage bags. His father didn't look at him. "Linda and I need our space. Her boys are moving in. There's no room." Tommy's mother had been gone 3 years. Cancer. His older brother was somewhere in Vietnam. The new wife had 2 sons. The math was simple, and it didn't add up to Tommy. "Where am I supposed to go?" His father shrugged. He handed Tommy a folded stack of cash, $200. "Figure it out. You're 18. That's old enough." No hug, no apology. Just the money, the bags, and the sound of the screen door closing behind him. A final, soft click. Childhood was over. He picked up the bags and started walking. He had $200, 3 changes of clothes, and nowhere to go. He walked 3 miles to the edge of Dora, Iowa, a town of 3,000 souls where everyone knew your business by sundown. By tomorrow, they'd all know about Tommy Hansen. He sat on a bench outside Morrison's Standard, the gas station on the county line, and counted the money again. $200, his entire net worth, his entire future sitting in sweaty 20s in his palm. A shadow fell across him. Tom Morrison, who owned the dairy farm west of town and the station they were sitting in front of. Tommy knew him from church. "You okay, son?" "Yes, sir." "You don't look okay. You look like the world just ended." And Tommy broke. The dam he'd been holding back since the driveway gave way. He told him everything. The sound of the pickup, the garbage bags, the $200, the closed door. Tom Morrison sat down beside him. He was a man in his 60s, his hands permanently stained with grease and ground-in soil. He listened. Then he was quiet for a long minute, just watching the heat waves rise off the asphalt. "I need help on my farm," he finally said. "Can't pay much, 60 a week. You can sleep in the barn loft, 3 meals a day. Interested?" Tommy looked at him, his face raw. "Why would you help me?" "Because I was you once. Different circumstances, same situation. Somebody helped me. I'm passing it on." That's how Tommy Hansen became a farmhand at 18, sleeping in a barn loft, working sunrise to sunset for $60 a week. The loft had no heat. That first winter, the temperature dropped to 20 below. Tommy slept in all his clothes under 3 wool blankets Tom's wife Martha gave him. Some mornings, he'd wake up and his hands would be so stiff with cold he couldn't make a fist to pull the blankets off. The work was brutal and constant. 40 Holsteins to milk twice a day, manure to scrape, fences to mend. But the work was a mercy. It left no room in his head for the shame. And the shame was the worst of it. It was a physical weight. He'd walk into the diner on a Saturday morning and conversations would stutter to a stop. People would look, then quickly look away. The pity in their eyes was a hotter burn than any summer sun. He started avoiding town. He worked, he ate with Tom and Martha in their warm kitchen, and he retreated to his cold loft. He saved every penny, lived on nothing. After 3 months, he had $640 in a coffee can hidden under a floorboard in the loft. It was a number, a proof. He could look at it and see something he'd built from nothing. One Saturday in late November, brittle cold in the air, he saw the ad in the Dora Gazette while cleaning up at the station. It was in the classifieds, a tiny box of text. 1951 John Deere Model A. Needs work. $200. Call Henry. A 1951 Model A. A 2-cylinder putt-putt. The backbone of 1,000 small farms. He called the number. An old man's voice, cracked like dry leather. He got directions. The tractor sat in the back of Henry Olson's machine shed. Henry was 76, bent like a question mark from a lifetime of leaning into engines. The shed smelled of dust, old hay, and rust. The John Deere wasn't just old. It was defeated. It sat on flat, rotten tires. The paint was faded to a sickly gray-green, like moss on a tombstone. The engine was seized solid. It hadn't turned over in 5 years. Henry watched him look it over. Why you want this junk? I'm going to fix it. You know how to fix tractors? I'm learning. Henry studied him, his eyes sharp under bushy white brows. You're that Hanson kid. Got kicked out. Yes, sir. And you got $200 to spend on a broken tractor. I saved it, working for Mr. Morrison. Henry was quiet for a long time. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Tell you what, you can have it for $150. Use the extra $50 for parts. You fix it here in my shed. Take as long as you need. When it runs, you haul it away. Tommy couldn't believe it. Why? Because any kid who gets kicked out and saves money instead of wasting it deserves a break, Henry said. He patted the fender of the dead tractor. It made a dull, hollow sound. And because this old iron deserves to run again. Been sitting too long. Tommy paid the $150. He shook Henry's leathery hand. Now he owned a tractor. A dead tractor. The restoration began the next Sunday, and every Sunday after that, for 4 months. He'd walk the 3 miles to Henry's shed at dawn, work until his hands wouldn't work anymore, then walk back in the dark. The first job was the engine. If it wouldn't turn, nothing else mattered. It was seized tighter than a bank vault. Henry showed him the first step. They pulled the spark plugs. The holes looked like dark, dry wells. Henry handed him a can of penetrating oil. This is the part that tests you, Henry said. This ain't about strength. It's about patience. You pour this in, you wait. You try, you fail. You pour more in, you wait longer. Tommy filled each cylinder. The oil vanished into the darkness. He left it for a week. The following Sunday, he fitted a 3-foot breaker bar onto the crankshaft nut. He put his weight into it. Nothing. Not a fraction of movement. The iron might as well have been welded. He felt the strain in his shoulders, his back. He poured more oil in. This was the pattern. A week of waiting, a Sunday of straining against immovable metal. His palms blistered, the blisters broke, and the skin hardened into calluses. His back ached from the unnatural angle. The shed was unheated. Some mornings, his breath fogged the air, and the metal of the wrench was so cold it felt like it burned. He'd work until he was sweating under his coat, then stop and feel the sweat go cold on his skin. That was the inheritance. Not the land, not the name. This stubborn, silent resistance. This refusal to move. Week 7. He'd stopped expecting anything. He fitted the bar, leaned into it out of habit more than hope. And something gave. Not much, less than an inch of rotation. But it moved. A dry, cracking groan came from deep inside the block. The sound of rust breaking its grip. He didn't shout. He froze. He backed off, then gently pushed again. Another fractional turn. A faint, gritty crunch. Henry, who'd been pretending to tinker at his workbench, ambled over. He didn't say a word, just nodded once, like he'd expected it all along, and went back to his bench. Week 8. The movement became smoother. A full revolution, then 2. The pistons were breaking free in their dry, scored cylinders. Tommy kept pouring oil, kept working the crank back and forth, flushing out decades of grit and varnish. Then, one gray March afternoon, he gave the crank a pull. It spun freely. A full, smooth, uninterrupted rotation. The engine turned over like it was meant to. He stood there in the silent shed, the only sound the drip of melting snow off the roof. He looked at his hands, black with grease and oil, trembling slightly. And then he started to cry. He was 18 years old, crying in a drafty shed because a piece of old iron decided to move. He wiped his face with a greasy sleeve, leaving a dark smear. He felt Henry's hand on his shoulder. Most grown men couldn't do what you just did, the old man said, his voice quiet. You're 18, and you just talked a seized engine back to life. Remember this feeling. This is how you build something that lasts. Tommy nodded, unable to speak. The emotion was too big for words. It was pride, yes, but deeper than that, it was a quiet, ferocious hope. If this engine could turn, then maybe his life could too. Maybe the path wasn't closed. Maybe it was just seized up, waiting for the right application of pressure and patience and time. The engine turned, but it wasn't a tractor. Not yet. Now the real work began. the kind of work that separates a runner from a worker. Henry called it chasing the ghosts out of the machine. Every system had to be rebuilt, not just freed. The carburetor came off next. It was a simple Marvel Schebler updraft, but inside, the gasoline had evaporated years ago, leaving behind a hard, amber varnish that clogged every passage and jet like arterial plaque. Tommy disassembled it on Henry's bench, laying each tiny part, the float pin, the needle valve, the main jet, on a clean rag. He bought a rebuild kit for $18. The new gaskets were pale green and smelled like new rubber. He soaked the metal parts in a coffee can full of carburetor cleaner, watching the varnish dissolve into a foul-smelling soup. Reassembly was a lesson in precision. The float had to be set just right. Too high, it would flood. Too low, it would starve. Henry watched him, offering only one piece of advice. Tighten until it's snug, then give it one more kiss. Not a pull, a kiss. These are brass. They'll tell you when they've had enough. The fuel tank was a cavern of rust. He drained the 5-year-old sludge, then followed Henry's recipe. A handful of clean gravel, a quart of kerosene. He duct taped the filler hole shut and spent an hour rolling the tank back and forth across the shed floor. The sound was like a dying thunderstorm. He poured out a slurry of rust and kerosene, then sealed the inside with a brush-on liner that smelled like chemical death. It had to cure for 3 days. Time he didn't have, but time the machine demanded. The magneto was next, the heart of the spark. It was dead. No output. He could have bought a replacement for $80. Instead, he found the name of a rebuilder in Cedar Rapids. He borrowed Tom Morrison's pickup for the 3-hour round trip. The shop was in a basement, run by a man who looked like he was made of old vacuum tubes and solder. $42. The man handed him the rebuilt unit, its coil freshly varnished, points gleaming. "Treat her right," the man said. "She'll outlive you." Wiring was a foreign language. Tommy knew muscle and grease, not electrons. The old harness was brittle, cracked, a fire waiting to happen. He bought a spool of wire, a soldering iron, and a diagram. He learned to solder by burning his fingertips twice. The smell of melting rosin core filled the shed. He ran the new wires neatly, clipping them to the frame with little metal tabs, creating order from the old chaos. The tires were the last great physical battle. He found 4 used 12 by 28 rear tires at a salvage yard for $38. They had decent tread, but were stiff as wood. Mounting them, alone, with just pry bars and a sledgehammer, was an 8-hour war of attrition. He'd get one beat over the rim, and the other would pop off. His hands were raw, then bloody. Henry finally came out, didn't say a word, just picked up a second pry bar and leaned his old weight into the opposite side. Together, they seated the last tire with a final, solid thump. Tommy stood there, breathing hard, looking at the tractor now standing on its own feet for the first time in years. Then came the paint. He scraped and sanded until his arms felt like lead. The old green came off in flakes, revealing the red primer, then the bare, pitted metal. He brushed on the new John Deere green, then the iconic yellow on the wheels and radiator. The smell was sharp, industrial. It wasn't a show-quality job. You could see the brush strokes if you looked close. But from 10 feet away, it looked proud. It looked like it had a purpose again. Final assembly was a silent ritual. Fuel line, carburetor, magneto, wires. He filled the radiator, the crankcase. He poured 5 gallons of fresh diesel into the cured tank. He looked at Henry. The old man just nodded. Tommy climbed onto the metal seat. He pulled the choke. He turned the key to the mag position. He took a deep breath and pushed the starter button. The engine cranked. It coughed. A dry, ragged sound. It died. His heart sank into his boots. He pushed the button again. More cranking. A pop, then a backfire that echoed in the shed. Then a sputter. A ragged, uneven rhythm. It caught. Blue smoke billowed from the stack, the smell of burning oil and old carbon. The engine smoothed, found its familiar 2-cylinder heartbeat. Put, 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 put. It was running. Not just turning, running. He sat there, the old iron trembling to life beneath him, the sound filling the shed, pushing out the silence of 5 years. He didn't cry this time. He just listened. The tractor ran. But a running tractor without ground under its wheels is just a noisy paperweight. Tom Morrison saw him puttering around the shed yard that spring. He leaned against the fence, chewing on a stalk of grass. "You've got a tractor," Tom said. "Now you need a note." Tommy killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy. A note? A debt. A promise to pay. Tom spat the grass out. "I'll rent you 20 acres of my back 40. You farm it. Pay me after harvest. Use your tractor. Borrow my planter and cultivator. See if you can make the math work." It was a vote of confidence more valuable than any loan. Tommy took the deal. That spring, he worked Tom's dairy from sunup to mid-afternoon. Then he'd climb onto the Model A and head to his 20 acres. The planting window was short, the days long. He'd work his own ground until the light failed, eating a cold sandwich in the seat, the tractor's putt-putt the only sound for miles. The corn came up, a thin green promise across the black soil. He'd walk the rows in the evening, checking for weeds, for pests, feeling a responsibility he'd never known. This was his. His sweat, his tractor, his risk. Then the rain stopped. June was dry. July was a brick oven. By August, the land was cracked and the corn was stressed, its leaves curling tight like fists. Tommy watched the sky, a helpless dread in his gut. You could fix a tractor. You couldn't fix the weather. The drought of 1970 broke a lot of men. It yielded 61 bushels to the acre, where there should have been 90. When he settled up that fall, after paying Tom his rent and covering the seed and fuel, his profit was $914. He'd worked 6 months for less than $5 a day. He sat in the barn loft that night, doing the math on a feed sack. At this rate, buying land was a century away. The factory in Waterloo was hiring. Steady pay, benefits, a roof that wasn't a hayloft. The thought was a seductive whisper. Tom found him. "Rough year? I worked for nothing." Tom sat beside him. "Let me tell you about 1936. Worst drought in history. My dad and I planted 300 acres, got 12 bushels an acre. Total. Lost everything that year. Thought about quitting." He looked out the loft door at the dark fields. "My dad said, 'Bad years teach you. Good years pay you. You need both to be a farmer.' I stayed. Next year was better. The year after that was great." He turned to Tommy. "You're 18. You made a profit in a drought year. Most men lost money. You didn't. That means you farm smart. The note isn't just money you owe. It's the price of the lesson. You just paid for a big one." Tommy stayed. The next lesson came in 71, and it was mechanical. He was planting his expanded 40 acres, pushing hard. He forgot to check the oil. The Model A burned a little. He knew that. He got complacent. The engine threw a rod bearing with a sound like a shotgun in a barrel. Panic is cold and sharp. The planting window was closing. He had no other tractor. Tom loaned him one to finish, but the John Deere was his foundation. He pulled the engine, took the crankshaft to the machine shop in Cedar Rapids. The bill was $340. It cleaned out his savings, left him with $72 to his name. He paid it. The lesson was cheaper than a new tractor. From that day on, he had a ritual. Every morning, before the sun was up, he'd walk around the Model A, check the oil, check the coolant, kick the tires, look for leaks. It took 5 minutes. It was a ceremony of respect. You don't neglect the thing that keeps you alive. Slowly, brick by brick, he built. 71 netted him $3,800. 72, $5,200. He bought a second tractor, a beat-up farmall, for $800 cash, no loan. By 73, at 21, he was renting 120 acres and had $18,000 in the bank. He still lived in the room off Tom's kitchen. He still drove a rusted pickup. To the town, he was just the kicked-out kid getting by. Then the opportunity came. Tom's neighbor died. His widow was selling the farm. 160 acres, asking $48,000. Tommy looked at his $18,000, looked at the land. The math said he needed $30,000 more. The math said debt. The very thing he'd been running from since the day his father handed him $200 and closed the door. He went to the bank. The loan officer, a young man in a stiff suit, looked at him like he was a stray dog. "You're 21. You want $30,000. What's your collateral?" "My savings, my tractors, my labor." The man almost smiled. "That's not how this works." Tommy felt the old shame rising, hot in his throat. He was being measured and found wanting. Again. But then he thought of the seized engine, the patience, the leverage. "Sir," he said, his voice quieter than he wanted, "I was kicked out at 18 with $200. In 3 years, I've saved $18,000 farming. Ask Tom Morrison. Ask anyone. I'll make this work. I just need a chance." The loan officer left. He came back with the bank president, an older man with eyes that had seen a few cycles of boom and bust. "Morrison speaks highly of you," the president said. "Says you're the hardest working kid he's ever seen." He looked at Tommy's hands, still stained from that morning's grease. "I'll approve 20,000, 8%, 10 years. Payments are $243 a month. Can you handle that?" Tommy did the math in his head. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was tight. So tight. One bad year and he'd lose it all. "Yes, sir," he said. "I can handle it." He walked out of the bank with a note, a promise to pay. It felt like a chain around his neck, but it was also a key. He combined it with his life savings and bought the land for $38,000 cash. The first night he owned it, he walked every acre in the dark. The soil under his boots was his. No one could take it. No one could tell him to leave. The debt was a weight, but the land was an anchor. For the first time since he was a boy, he was home. The good years paid. From 73 to 80, Tommy expanded. He bought another 80 acres, paid cash. He married Linda, the school teacher who didn't mind the grease under his nails. They had a son, Thomas, and Tommy felt a love so fierce it terrified him. He was building something solid, something anchored in owned dirt and sweat equity. Then the weather changed. Not in the sky, but in the books. It started in 81. Interest rates, which had been sitting at a manageable 8% on his original note, began to climb. 9, 10. Then they shot to 16, then 18%. Money itself was seizing up. At the same time, the bottom fell out of the land market. The value of his 240 acres, which the bank had happily used as collateral, began to evaporate. It wasn't a drought. It was a financial frost that killed from the roots up. He'd hear it at the co-op, in line at the parts counter. Stories told in hushed, shattered tones. Men he'd known his whole life, third, fourth generation farmers, were losing everything. The bank would call in their note, the land value wouldn't cover it, and they'd be sold out at auction. The debt trap, a thing he'd only heard about in warnings, was springing shut all around him. His own note was manageable, but the pressure was a constant, low-grade hum. Every month, $243 left his account. In 83, corn prices dropped to $2 and change. His profit margin, once a comfortable cushion, shrank to a razor's edge. He looked at his spreadsheets, the numbers written in pencil in a ledger book, and saw no room for error. None. He cut everything. Drove the same truck until the floorboards rusted through. Linda went back to teaching part-time. They ate what they grew, patched clothes until the patches wore out. The dream wasn't expansion anymore. It was endurance. The true test came in the fall of 85. A hailstorm ripped through just before harvest, shredding 40 acres of his best corn. The insurance payment was a fraction of the loss. He sat at the kitchen table that night, the ledger open, the numbers refusing to add up to safety. He had the mortgage payment due, and now a massive income shortfall. For the first time since he'd walked to Henry's shed, he thought about asking for help, a loan extension. But he'd seen what that did. It was just a longer rope in the same trap. Instead, he did the only thing he knew. He got leaner. He sold the farmall, the second tractor he'd bought with cash. It hurt, like selling a good horse, but it injected $5,000 into his operation without a note. He took on custom haying for 3 neighbors, running his equipment dawn to dusk, trading his labor for their cash. He and Linda didn't take a dime for themselves that winter. Every penny went to the land payment. He made it. By the skin of his teeth, with his knuckles white on the wheel, he made the payment. He looked around at the empty machine shed, the silent fields, and felt not victory, but a hollow, exhausted relief. He had survived. But the cost was visible. The farm was stripped back to its bones. Just him, Linda, the boy, and the original Model A. That was the lesson the crisis burned into him. Debt wasn't just a number on a page. It was a claim on your future labor, a weight on your choices, a constant vulnerability. The men who failed weren't lazy. They were good farmers. They just accepted a note that the world decided, suddenly, it wouldn't honor. Tommy had survived because his note was small, and his tolerance for pain was high. He'd survived because he'd already learned to live on nothing. He'd survived because when the hailstorm hit, he had an asset, that second tractor he could sell in a day for cash. Not to buy more, but to keep what he already had. The crisis years didn't make him rich. They made him hard. They proved that the old iron philosophy worked. Simple machines, paid for in full, could outlast any storm on a ledger sheet. The crisis passed, leaving scars on the land and the people who worked it. Tommy owned his acres, free and clear of the original note by '87. But the lesson was welded into his soul. He expanded again, but differently. He'd rent land for cash flow, but he only bought more when he had the full amount in the bank. No more notes. The Model A, now almost 40 years old, still puttered along, its two-cylinder heartbeat the rhythm of his life. He taught his son, Thomas, on that tractor. Not just how to drive it, but how to listen to it. How the sound of the valves could tell you about compression. How a faint blue haze from the exhaust meant it was time for new rings. He showed him the ledger, too, the one with no red ink. Debt, he'd say, tapping the page with a greasy finger, is a tolerance you can't measure with a micrometer. It's the slack in the system that lets everything shake apart when the load gets heavy. We run tight. The boy learned. He learned to fix before he replaced. He learned that a paid-off field slept easier than one with a bank's name on it. In 2020, on a crisp fall day, Tommy hooked a trailer to his truck. Not to haul the Model A to a show, but to take it home. He drove to the old Olson place. Henry's grandson Robert lived there now. The machine shed was gone, replaced by a metal building, but the land was the same. Robert came out, squinting in the sunlight. Tommy backed the old tractor off the trailer. It started on the first crank, the sound unchanged after 70 years. Grandpa would get a kick out of that, Robert said, a smile touching his eyes. I brought it to show you, Tommy said, his voice rough. A circle needs to close. He told Robert about the drought years, the crisis, the family. He didn't talk about millions. He talked about bushels and brake horsepower and the peace of a clear title. Your grandfather's kindness was the first turn of the crank. This is where it all started. They stood there, two old men and an older piece of iron, the past and the present in the same quiet moment. A few years later, a man in a suit from John Deere corporate paid a visit. He'd heard the story. He stood in Tommy's shed, looking at the Model A with the eyes of a curator, not a farmer. We'd like to put it in our museum, he said. We could offer a substantial figure. It's a piece of history. Tommy ran a hand along the fender, feeling the brushstrokes under his palm. It's not for sale. We're talking about a legacy, preserving it. Tommy looked at him. Its legacy is right here. It's in the grease under my boy's nails. It's in the way my grandson knows how to set a points gap. You put it behind glass, and it becomes a story. You leave it here, and it's still a tool. It's still teaching. He shook his head. The answer's no, not for any price. The man left, a little bewildered. Tommy wasn't being stubborn. He was being faithful. The tractor was a covenant, a promise he'd made to himself in Henry's cold shed that broken things could be made whole, and that wholeness was something you protected, not sold. The true broken thing wasn't the tractor. It was the cycle. The cycle of abandonment his father had handed him, and the cycle of debt that consumed so many of his neighbors. He'd repaired both. He'd built a family that knew it was loved, on land that knew it was owned. The tractor still starts every month, 71 years old. The compression is still good. Legacy isn't the land or the money. It's the silence where the collector's call used to ring. It's the sound of your grandson laughing in the seat where you once cried. Old iron teaches you that debt is the real seized engine. And mechanical integrity, Piece by paid for piece is the only thing that mirrors a life built to last. Subscribe if you believe the old ways of fixing things are worth saving.